Wow. Well, good evening and welcome. And first of all, thank you for making it through the weather. It's shocking out there. And what a treat it is for a deservedly full house for the H Advisors Book Club tonight. We have a fantastic book and a fantastic author, a fantastic journalist, fantastic writer to come and talk to us tonight. Katie Prescott, the technology editor from The Times, who has produced what I could only describe as a complete, rip-snorting read about the life and times, the extraordinary life and times of Mike Lynch, which we will scratch the surface of in the next 45 minutes. For those of you who, and I can see some regulars, and thank you very much for the people who keep coming back to book club. But this one is truly for those of you who I was going to say, for those of you who have not been before, Katie and I will chat together for the next 40 minutes or so, and then I'm really keen that a lot of you all get an opportunity to ask a question or actually share a recollection, because I was going to start with a question for all of you. How many people here tonight actually met Mike Lynch or knew him? So actually a reasonable, sample of the audience had some dealings with the man who sadly died about 18 months ago. As a gift from us to you, there is a copy of Katie's book at the back, which, unless she's rushing away into the rain and the cold, she might even be prepared to sign. Let's start with an easy one. Who was Mike Lynch?
That's so easy, it's almost difficult to answer. So Mike Lynch was one of the UK's most well-known, but also most controversial entrepreneurs. He was a tech entrepreneur, I'd say, before being a tech entrepreneur was a thing. So he started his company, Autonomy, in the 1990s, which is essentially a search engine for corporates, in an era where information and the use of computers was growing exponentially, and it really captured that market. And he very quickly floated his business, and it joined the NASDAQ and the FTSE, very quickly was pushed into the FTSE 100 during the dot-com boom. And so he rode the wave of the dot-com boom. And I should say, though, he hadn't come from a very wealthy or academic background. His dad was a fireman, his mum was a nurse. He was brought up in Essex, and he won a scholarship to a public school where he did incredibly well, and all of his friends who I spoke to at school said he was very quickly earmarked as one of the brightest boys of his year group. He went on to Cambridge, and that is how his sort of entrepreneurial career began.
I mean, there's a lot more, because, of course, you missed the next few chapters, which is he makes a fortune, sells the business to Hewlett-Packard, who then turn around and accuse him of fraud.
We don't want to summarise the whole book and start at that.
And then, he gets off and dies in extraordinary circumstances. But let me ask, someone once told me that a biographer always ends up falling in love with their subject. But having read this book, you clearly did not fall in love with Mike Lynch.
One of the hardest things about writing a biography of someone is you go to bed with them every night. And no, I didn't, actually. If anything, I fell out of love with him as I was writing the book. And that's a really horrible thing to say. And it was a very, very difficult book to write. As most of you will know, I wrote it in the immediate aftermath of his death. I'd actually started writing it before he died. It was meant to be a sort of corporate thriller about the story of Autonomy, his company, how it was bought by Hewlett-Packard, and then the subsequent fallout and catastrophic legal case around that. But I almost came to the Mike Lynch story with quite fresh eyes. So I'm 42. It was really the generation of journalists above me who'd known him very well and covered him in his heyday, when they'd fallen out with him too, I should say, in the main. And I think the story I wanted to write was of Britain's Bill Gates, which is what he was sometimes known as, and of a sort of plucky British entrepreneur who ended up taking having a battle with this US giant and sadly losing. I think the more and more people I interviewed, even those very close to him, the more I struggled with how I thought about him. Frankly, at points it was like being gaslit writing about him, because he had a difficult relationship with the truth. And so often I would read an interview or listen to an interview, because journalists were very, very generous at giving me recordings that they'd done with him. It's an interesting question. I haven't really spoken about this before, actually. And then I just find that it wasn't true when I did an interview. And that was really difficult. I mean, to the extent that the other day I was with a very senior journalist who said, "Oh yeah, Mike Lynch, I met him once, and we talked all about growing up in Finchley." I said, "Well, he didn't grow up in Finchley." That kept happening. People would tell me a story, or he would, say something, and then it was just not true.
I mean, that was one thing that struck me is early on, the first, Autonomy's first CFO was a man called Frank Bridges. And maybe you could tell us about Frank Bridges.
Yes, Frank Bridges was mysteriously never in the office because he didn't exist. Now, just great for a CFO if someone's chasing an invoice, you can just never get hold of them. But it almost became a code in the Autonomy office. Well, I think this was actually the business before Cambridge Neurodynamics. But people would know if the phone rang for Frank Bridges that it was someone chasing some money. I don't think there is a straight line between the Frank Bridges story and some of the other myths around Mike's early businesses and some of the untruths that he told. I think some of that I actually quite enjoyed. It felt to me like entrepreneurial flair, a sort of fake it till you make it.
I mean, that's the point, because at what stage he clearly created a mythology about himself, growing up in Finchley when he didn't, and all sorts of, but at what stage does creating a mythology turn into downright dishonesty and ultimately fraud?
One of the painful things about writing a book is people tend to ring you up once they've read it and say, "Oh, I was, really close to Mike," and then tell you a story you wish you'd known while you were writing the book. I have had so many people who worked at the upper echelons of Autonomy contact me in the last few months and say that working there was like being in Alice in Wonderland, because you never really quite knew what was true. So I think it's a more serious and perhaps more sinister thing that I'm describing than the Frank Bridges story, which I actually found very endearing.
I mean, but strip it away, what he did create, or what he and his technology team did create, was some extraordinary software that guides the way we deal with data today in many ways, or is that overstating it?
I think that is overstating it. I think it was an amazing piece of software at its time. I think as the company grew, so it was thrust into the FTSE 100 as, I need to get my numbers right because I haven't read the book for a while, but I think it was a $4 billion valuation on something like revenues of £40 million. Okay, so this is like, maybe comparison with the AI era as well. And then very quickly when the bust happened, it wasn't again in the FTSE 100, I think, till 2007, 2008. And when it started, speaking to the technologists within the company, when it started to take on bigger contracts, actually it did struggle. And which is why we got into the issues with accounting when the company was sort of desperate to meet its targets. That's not to say it was vaporware or this was the emperor's new clothes. He did create an astonishing company that spanned Britain and the US and grew really, really quickly and was riding the wave of, the digital era in a way that other companies struggle to do. But this wasn't an arm. I think is that fair to say?
I mean, the other point, the other key facet that comes across in the early pages and then probably all the way through is he comes across as a bully, a tyrannical bully. Is that a fair depiction in 2 words?
Yes, well, I think I should say, and for the people who knew him in this room, everybody has a different relationship with everyone, right? And a different perception of them and a different experience of them. But yes, I found that junior people who worked with him certainly, and actually even those in his inner circle, were bullied by him. But someone said to me the other day, and maybe this is right, you don't get to be a successful entrepreneur without having a slightly difficult personality. And I struggle to think of any successful entrepreneurs I know who don't have a bit of that in them. So perhaps they're two sides of the same coin. But yes, I heard some horrible stories, I'm afraid.
There's certainly multiple facets to him, and we'll try and explore them. I mean, one of those is, was he a brilliant technologist, on a Cambridge PhD, or was he a brilliant marketeer?
I tried to explore this in quite a bit of detail and heard differing views. He certainly was not a scholar at Christ College. His name is not on the scholarship board. He got a 2-1 in his finals and a 2-2 in his second year. It's quite unusual for someone to get a 2-1 and then go and do a PhD. But he did because his professors saw a spark in him. And I think what he had, which is really special and actually quite unusual amongst technologists, was an ability to see the commercial in the tech. And one of the stories I tell in the book is how he got the idea for Autonomy, which was from a kind of peer at Christ, a guy who was in the year below him, who was involved in IR, as it was called in Cambridge at the time, information retrieval, which is the kind of stuff that Google ends up doing. But at the time, they were exploring how you kind of got information effectively. That wasn't what Mike specialised in at Cambridge. He specialised in signal processing, in audio visual. So he got this idea from someone else, but he managed to turn it into Autonomy. He could see the potential to make this an enormous business. And I think that really is where his skill set lay.
And then leverage it through sales and marketing.
Exactly.
High pressure.
Yeah.
I think
which is impressive in itself.
Let's go forward to something that obviously dominates a lot of the story of Autonomy, and in fact the many years after Autonomy was sold to HP. For lay people in this room, and I include myself in that, the argument seems to be that, well, Autonomy had sold software, but it sold a bit of hardware as well. And what's the problem with that?
Okay, so fast forward to 2008, 2009, and Autonomy was having problems keeping up selling as much software as it needed to in order to hit its numbers and hit city forecasts. And it started, as you say, selling hardware. Now, apparently it had always sold small bits of hardware along the way. But when I say hardware, we're talking about keyboards and mice and laptops and stuff it wasn't making itself. Software is super, super valuable because, prized because it doesn't have any overheads, essentially. If you come up with a string of code, you can ship it about for nothing. If you're selling hardware, obviously there's a cost to that, not least when you're buying it from Dell and then selling it on. But Autonomy started doing that, and initially in quite large quantities. So the first quarter, and we have a huge amount of information on this, by the way, because of the 3 massive court cases and the Financial Reporting Council's investigation into Autonomy that happened after it was sold to Hewlett-Packard. But there was one quarter where 20% of its revenue came from reselling hardware from other people.
At a loss.
At a loss. But also they did
saying.
not tell the market that's what they were doing. So they would sit in a room like this with city analysts who were covering the business and say we were a pure software company. And that was what it said on all of the company accounts. On that one occasion, if we're talking about the quarter where they sold 20% of hardware at a loss, they needed to put this loss somewhere. And so Mike Lynch told the city that it had the money had gone on marketing for a new product, which also didn't exist, called the structured probabilistic engine. And this is where his difficult relationship with the truth really comes to the fore. Often when he would say something that was untrue, it sounds very plausible, and it's quite difficult to argue with. If I say to you, I'm making this structured probabilistic engine, like he said to the analyst from Goldman Sachs, I can't really tell you all the details.
I read it and I wanted to buy it.
because it's really exciting.
Yes. Even all these years later, I wanted one.
And it actually, it comes out very clearly in all the trial transcripts when so many people came forward from Autonomy that this thing just didn't exist, or at least it might have been put forward as an idea, but this money had not gone on marketing for the SPE. So that's where the thing started.
Book, I mean, having followed it, your book, until I read it, it wasn't until I read it I realised how wrong the software, hardware reporting lines, and I'm sure there's some technical people in the audience who are happy to go over this. But, it led to a very high price sale.
And one of the analysts, David Toms, who was one of the sort of shining lights of the tech analysts at the time, said they called themselves a pure software company. I took it to mean they sold purely software, which is not an unfair thing to take from that.
So the business was bought by Hewlett-Packard, and you described it as a marriage made in hell in one of your many memorable one-liners in the book. And then Hewlett-Packard, not long after, starts pursuing Mike, for enormous amounts of damages and accusing them of fraud. Wasn't this just sour grapes by Hewlett-Packard for not having done its due diligence and made a mistake?
I think that HP certainly does not come out of this book looking brilliant. There was I don't like to use the word smell, but there were suspicions around Autonomy's numbers before HP came knocking. They did 18 days due diligence on the company before they bought it, $11 billion, which I think I say is more like squeezing fruit in a market stall than, kind of really looking at what you're buying. And it was just a complete mess. It was I think, I don't want to leave everyone with a negative impression of Mike Lynch. He was super bright. He had a great sense of humour. And he didn't suffer fools gladly. And I think going into HP when you're a company of 2,500 people, and he'd never had a boss in his life. He'd started this business when he was in his 20s. Before that, he'd been running a music tech company. And suddenly, he's propelled into a business with 300,000 people, which someone described to me as being like the civil service. So you've got this live, entrepreneurial, British, quite quirky company that has an unusual relationship with the truth, and then Hewlett-Packard. But I don't like to sort of put blame on either side for this, really. But yes, they didn't do their due diligence properly. And then as soon as they bought the company, the boss who'd wanted to buy it, Leo Apotheker, got fired.
Even before they had bought the company.
Before the deal had closed. And then it was left in the hands of a lady called Meg Whitman, who had been the boss of eBay. And her and Mike just hated each other. So there's a massive clash of personalities. And the company wasn't making its numbers. Autonomy always said that the way that they were absorbed into Hewlett-Packard meant that they couldn't, and that they were treated like the unwanted stepchild within the business. And HP started uncovering all sorts of funny things about Autonomy they didn't like. And very quickly, Meg ended up firing Mike. And a lot of his team walked out afterwards. And then a year later, he was accused of fraud.
And that goes through the process of the civil trial, which went on for ages, the extradition proceedings, which went on for ages, and then a US criminal trial. And I think myself and an awful lot of people didn't think he stood a chance in that US criminal trial. How did he get off?
The trial was a dual trial with him and a chap called Stephen Chamberlain, who was the vice president of finance at Autonomy. So he was under Sushavan Hussain, his CFO. And that was quite a difficult trial for the Department of Justice to run, I gather, because you're talking about the CEO of the business and then someone at a more junior level. So they're almost fighting on two fronts. It is software accounting. I mean, I try to make it interesting in the book, but it's quite difficult to explain, let alone to a lay jury. And there are a lot of people who've questioned and discussed with me whether it's the right forum, indeed, to try these sorts of cases. By the point of Mike's trial, his legal team had lived through the witnesses telling their stories twice before, because they sat through the civil trial, they sat through Hussein's criminal trial, and then the same witnesses came out. It was like Groundhog Day, that third criminal trial in California, and they did the same thing. So they were very well prepared. And they developed a very clever analogy, which is if you look into any kitchen, you're bound to find some bacteria. And that resonated really well with the jury. But the sort of absolute nail, final nail, was Mike Lynch testifying himself. So you've got a charismatic entrepreneur telling a San Franciscan jury familiar with, you know, the stories of entrepreneurs and the entrepreneurial journey, his life story. And he'd said that, you know, he was eating pizza with his techies at 2:00 in the morning. I mean, I don't think that's quite the case. But they really bought that and warmed to him. And I think it was that sheer force of his personality and the story that told to him, which meant they didn't feel that they could find him guilty beyond reasonable doubt. So there's a confluence of different things
going on. It was the
on.
performance of his life.
That's right, yeah.
And in many ways, it was the performance of his life, because 2 weeks later, he was dead.
Yes, a few weeks later, yeah. Out sailing with so many of the people who'd been involved in the Autonomy trial. Jonathan Bloomer, who'd been chair of his audit committee, who'd also testified for him in California. Chris Mavillo, his lead attorney, who was the one who talked him through that performance. Very, very rehearsed, and a very, very well-liked man by all accounts. And then, of course, his daughter, Hannah, who tragically died alongside him.
Now, we have to ask you this question, because even on the flyleaf of the book, you say the chances of Mike and his co-defendant dying within 24 hours of each other are 4 in 1 billion. So was it really accidental, or did someone who didn't want them at liberty have a hand in it?
It's the perfect conspiracy theory story, isn't it? And there are so many conspiracy theories around this. I don't think it was anything other than a really, really tragic accident. And I think sometimes there are these things which are just unexplainable. I mean, one person I spoke to who was very close to both men who died said neither Steve nor Mike were living their normal lives at this point. I should say, for those of you who don't know, Steve was out running. He was a really, really keen runner and had taken up running as a way of sort of getting rid of the stress of the trials that were hanging over him. And he was hit by a car. His inquest found, you know, accidental death. The lady who hit him stopped. But they weren't. It's right. They weren't living their normal lives. They'd expected both of them to be sent to prison. It seemed like there was no way they were going to win that case, and yet there they were back with their families. I don't know, but I think I'm afraid it was just an accident. And I've really tried, including speaking to the security services and all that sort of stuff. And
where are all the cases? I mean, is Hewlett-Packard still pursuing his family for? Has a number been named yet?
Not a final one. I mean, it's mad, isn't it? If you think about it, the sale happened in 2011. We're now in 2026. It's dreadful for all concerned. Actually, it's one of the things that struck me most about, well, not most, but this is sort of sidebar of the book, was just litigation can go on and on and on. It's like jaundice, and you know, no one really wins at the end of it. So the civil case was won by Hewlett-Packard in London. The judge then had to go away and work out how much, had the accounts been as they really should have been, what would Hewlett-Packard have paid for the business. So he said that the Lynch estate now needs to pay HP £700 million. We estimate the estate's worth about 500 million. But HP's lawyers say they'd like to see interest on that, which pushes the number over £1 billion. And the judge is now away thinking about it and will come back with a number.
I mean, the
at some
interesting
point.
thing is there's no joint and several liability taken into account there. We'll wait and see. So, the story goes on.
But Saddam Hussein did settle, by the way,
yes.
so he's paid his
But in a way, that should be taken off the amount.
Yeah.
I mean, there should be a joint and several liability.
Sure,
I'm going to really, because as we said at the beginning, there are a number of people who met Mike Lynch and knew Mike Lynch. I met him on a couple of occasions, and I found him, gruff but perfectly sociable. But one or two people, I've got a note from someone I know here who's a friend of Mike's, who feels that you're quite harsh on him. And I just think it's worth reading out. Mike was generous and very clever. He was ferociously ambitious and somewhat gauche. He was arrogant, but he was a great spotter of talent and opportunity. And we haven't talked about all the other businesses he seeded, yes, and the money he made out of those as well. I fear he made enemies, some of who were probably jealous, because he was blunt and tough. He could be a bit of a show-off, but he had a good sense of humour and didn't take himself too seriously. He had balls of steel and was a pioneer. Britain has far too few real entrepreneurs like him. And then he says, was he a crook? Well, I think he did understand the accounts and probably encouraged aggressive policies, but the auditors did sign them off. So there were many sides to Mike Lynch.
There were many sides to him, and I really hope that other people reading the book feel that it is fair and balanced, and perhaps I haven't done a very good job of conveying that. When you asked me that question about how I felt about him, that really resonated. But I do talk about his ability to spot talent. As you say, the other businesses that he helped to create through his fund Invoke, not least Dark Trace, Feature Space, and Luminance. And
the hearing aid business, which,
Hearable,
as I get older, I'm taking more and more interest in.
Me too. Yes. I really think there were different mics depending on the level of person you were, and I don't know who that person is, but if they were a senior business person, they would tend to get a very different type of interaction than other people.
I think there are also different mics at different times of day in different situations, and I
hope the book is more nuanced than he.
Having read it, you don't spare him, but there are plenty of reflections of the strengths of his character and his intelligence and his drive, particularly his drive. I think there are a few more questions, but Katie has very kindly agreed to stay and will field all comers. There are pens here to sign books. A couple of bits and pieces. I always ask our authors, what's next? Apart from taking a deep breath.
There is a .com entrepreneur who I'm very interested in writing a book about. I'm keen to write a book which looks back at the .com boom and some of the chances that threw up as a way of sort of looking at some of the parallels with the AI boom today. I think there's rich pickings there.
Katie, thank you. Absolute tour de force. In terms of the book club, we will be back next month, and you will shortly be getting an invitation. But tonight, Katie, thank you.
Thank you. It's great.